Titus Flavius Vespasianus, more widely remembered simply as Titus, was born in 39 CE during the reign of Emperor Caligula, and his early life was shaped by the shifting fortunes of his father Vespasian, who was then a rising but uncertain senator and military commander within the tumultuous world of early imperial Rome. Unlike members of the old patrician aristocracy, Titus's family, the Flavians, were of equestrian background and provincial Italian origins. They did not possess the grandeur of names like the Iuli or the Claudi. Yet by the time of Titus's birth, the path to prominence for families of more humble stock had begun to open under emperors who valued military service and loyalty over ancient lineage. Titus's youth coincided with an era of increasing imperial centralization and declining senatorial independence, a world in which social mobility depended on military glory, political skill, and above all proximity to the emperor himself. From the beginning, Titus showed himself to be not only the heir to his father as ambition, but a man with gifts that extended beyond politics and the battlefield. He was educated in the traditional Roman style, studying rhetoric, law, literature, and philosophy, and he developed a reputation for both eloquence and intelligence. Ancient writers suggest that he was charming and cultured, a young man who could move with ease among senators, soldiers, and common citizens alike. His charisma, coupled with good looks and natural leadership, made him an attractive figure from the earliest stages of his career. The boyhood of Titus was further shaped by his close ties to the imperial court, where he grew up alongside Britannicus, the son of Emperor Claudius. This friendship gave him an early taste of imperial politics and brought him into contact with the dangerous and shifting alliances of Rome's ruling elite. Some sources suggest that Titus and Britannicus were particularly close, and this relationship had a tragic end when Britannicus was poisoned by Nero in 55 CE. Titus' survival while his imperial friend perished may have impressed upon him the cruel realities of court politics, the dangers of envy, and the necessity of caution in dealings with emperors. Despite this perilous environment, Titus thrived. He embarked on a military career, first serving in Germany, and then in Britain, gaining valuable experience as an officer under commanders who valued discipline and adaptability. These campaigns taught him both the practical skills of leadership and the brutality of warfare at Rome's frontiers. By the late 60s CE, Rome had entered one of the most dangerous phases of its imperial history, the civil wars of the Year of the Four Emperors. Nero's suicide in 68 CE left the empire without a direct Julio-Claudian heir, plunging the Roman world into a violent contest for power. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius each seized the throne in turn, but none was able to secure lasting authority. It was in this environment that Vespasian, commanding the legions in Judea during the Jewish revolt, was declared emperor by his troops and by the support of powerful eastern governors. Titus, as his son and trusted lieutenant, found himself at the center of events that would not only shape his destiny, but also determine the survival of Rome. Titus's role in the Jewish war is one of the most decisive elements of his rise to prominence. When his father Vespasian departed for Egypt and then Rome to secure his imperial claim in 69 CE, Titus was left in command of the Roman forces besieging Jerusalem. The Jewish revolt, which had begun in 66 CE, had seen the destruction of Roman garrisons and the humiliation of imperial authority in one of the empire's most troublesome provinces. For Vespasian, victory was necessary not only to secure his new dynasty as prestige, but also to demonstrate Rome as power to a restless empire. Titus carried out this task with both determination and ruthlessness. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE was one of the bloodiest and most destructive episodes in Roman military history. Ancient accounts, particularly from Josephus, describe how famine, disease, and civil strife ravaged the city's population even as the Roman legions tightened their grip. When the walls were finally breached, the temple, the most sacred site of the Jewish people, was burned and destroyed, Whether this was Titus's intention or the uncontrollable outcome of battle remains debated. But for contemporaries, the destruction of the temple marked the ultimate symbol of Rome's irresistible might. The triumph that followed in Rome was a defining moment in Titus's career. Alongside his father, he celebrated the Flavian victory in Judea with a magnificent triumphal procession. Spoils from the temple, including the great menorah, were carried through the streets of Rome, and Titus himself was hailed as a conqueror. The Arch of Titus, erected after his death, immortalized these events in stone, but already during his lifetime, his reputation as a victorious general and heir to the new imperial dynasty had been firmly established. He had proven himself not only as a capable commander, but also as a loyal son, securing for Vespasian the legitimacy that came from military success. This triumph also tied Titus's name forever to both glory and controversy. Glory in Rome as the destroyer of a rebellious province, and controversy in Jewish and later Christian memory as the man responsible for the destruction of the Second Temple. As heir to Vespasian, Titus was now in a position of unparalleled prominence. But with prominence came suspicion. Ancient authors, such as Suetonius and Tacitus, report that there were whispers of concern in Rome about Titus's closeness to the Praetorian Guard, his ambition, and his indulgence in pleasures. His love affair with the Jewish princess Bernice, who lived in Rome after the war, scandalized many Romans who were wary of Eastern queens wielding influence, recalling the memory of Cleopatra and her relationship with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. To Roman eyes, Bernice seemed too reminiscent of foreign intrigue, and Titus's attachment to her raised eyebrows in the Senate and among the people. Ultimately, Titus set her aside, recognizing that the appearance of independence and Roman virtue mattered more than personal desires. This decision may have pained him, but it demonstrated his political realism. Despite these controversies, Titus worked diligently at his father's side during the last decade of Vespasian's reign. He shared responsibilities in administration, acted as a partner in governance, and increasingly took on the role of co-emperor in all but name. He oversaw judicial matters, received delegations, and maintained the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, which was crucial to the security of the dynasty. His closeness to power bred rumors that he might be another Nero, indulgent and tyrannical. But in truth, his role was that of a careful apprentice, learning the mechanics of ruling while preparing to inherit the mantle of power. When Vespasian died in 79 CE, Titus succeeded smoothly, the first time since Augustus that a Roman emperor was directly succeeded by his natural son without civil war or usurpation. This peaceful transition was itself a testament to the stability Vespasian had restored and to the careful preparation that had made Titus acceptable to the legions, the Senate, and the people. Yet the world Titus inherited was not one of peace and tranquility. Within months of his accession, Mount Vesuvius erupted in southern Italy, burying the cities of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabia under volcanic ash and lava. This disaster shocked the empire, and Titus's response to it would prove a defining moment in his reign. His rise, therefore, was not only the story of a young man born into a rising family, but also the story of a general forged in war, a politician tested by scandal, and a son prepared for power by one of Rome's most pragmatic emperors. The figure of Titus, emerging from the civil wars, crowned by victory in Judea, and stepping into power at a time of both triumph and catastrophe, embodied the challenges and promises of the Flavian dynasty. His ascent marked the continuation of his father's legacy, but also the beginning of a reign that would be tested by disaster, defined by generosity, and remembered with surprising affection in Roman memory. As the empire entered its second stage of development, the foundations laid in the first period began to solidify into a stronger and more permanent framework that could sustain expansion, administration, and cultural integration. The early rulers and generals had secured initial conquests and established rudimentary systems of governance. But now came the challenge of turning those gains into something enduring. Territories needed to be reorganized, populations pacified, and resources efficiently exploited to maintain stability and growth. This was a time of consolidation as much as it was of expansion, and it defined how the empire would be remembered by later generations. The central authority faced constant challenges, from external enemies eager to reclaim lost ground to internal dissenters who resisted the imposition of foreign control. Yet, through persistence, adaptation, and at times sheer brutality, the empire began to take on the shape that would mark it as a lasting power. The rulers of this phase understood that conquest alone was insufficient to maintain control. Unlike the earlier period, where campaigns of war were the dominant theme, now diplomacy, negotiation, and alliances played an equally important role. Governors were appointed to oversee key provinces, and in many cases, these officials were drawn from both the imperial elite and the local nobility. By incorporating local leaders into the machinery of government, the empire created a sense of shared interest that reduced the likelihood of rebellion. Taxes were introduced in a more structured way, often collected in the form of grain or other agricultural produce, ensuring that both the capital and the armies in the provinces were fed. Roads and communication lines were expanded, allowing messages to travel faster and armies to move more efficiently across the empire's vast lands. This improved connectivity helped integrate the diverse peoples under imperial rule, though tensions often simmered beneath the surface. One of the greatest challenges of this period was maintaining unity among such diverse populations. The empire encompassed regions with different languages, religions, and traditions, and each new conquest added another layer of complexity. To manage this diversity, rulers often adopted a policy of tolerance, allowing local religious practices and cultural customs to continue so long as they did not directly threaten imperial authority. Temples were left intact, local festivals continued, and in some cases, imperial rulers even participated in local religious rites to show respect for their subjects. This pragmatic approach reduced unrest and allowed the people to see the empire not just as a foreign oppressor, but as a governing power willing to respect their traditions. Of course, this tolerance had its limits, and whenever loyalty was questioned or revolts broke out, the empire responded swiftly and often harshly to reassert control. Economically, this was a period of remarkable growth. The integration of conquered lands created vast new trade networks that linked distant regions in ways previously impossible. Goods such as grain, wine, olive oil, metals, and textiles flowed across the empire, enriching merchants and strengthening the treasury. Cities became bustling centers of commerce, drawing artisans, traders, and laborers from across the empire. Ports along the coastlines thrived as ships carried goods to and from the heartlands, while caravan routes across deserts and mountains linked inland territories to these hubs of trade. The empire's central markets became some of the most vibrant in the known world, attracting not only local merchants, but also foreign traders who sought to take advantage of the wealth concentrated within the imperial borders. This economic boom also fueled urban development. New cities were founded, and existing ones were expanded with impressive infrastructure projects. Public buildings, marketplaces, temples, and amphitheaters showcased the wealth and power of the empire while also serving practical functions for the people. Aqueducts and wells improved access to clean water, while roads and bridges facilitated commerce and communication. These developments did more than just improve the quality of life. They reinforced the sense that the empire was a bringer of order and prosperity. For many people, especially in the cities, life under imperial rule was preferable to the instability and constant warfare that had previously plagued their lands. This acceptance, born of tangible improvements, helped bind the empire together more firmly. Militarily, the empire continued to rely on its legions and auxiliary forces, but the nature of warfare began to shift. Whereas earlier campaigns had focused on large-scale conquests, now much of the military effort was devoted to maintaining borders, quelling uprisings, and securing trade routes. Forts and garrisons were established along the frontiers, creating defensive lines that could repel invasions or raids. Soldiers were stationed permanently in some regions, becoming both protectors and symbols of imperial authority. Over time, these military communities integrated with local populations, intermarrying and settling in the provinces they were meant to defend. This blending of soldiers and civilians further tied the provinces to the empire, as entire generations grew up with loyalty to the central power. Despite these successes, tensions were never far from the surface. Revolts broke out from time to time, often sparked by oppressive taxation, religious disputes, or the heavy-handed actions of local governors. In some cases, foreign powers encouraged rebellion as a way of destabilizing the empire's control. Each rebellion was a test of the empire's resilience, and while most were crushed with decisive force, they revealed the fragility of the imperial system. To maintain dominance, rulers had to strike a careful balance between leniency and severity, rewarding loyalty while punishing defiance. The ability to manage this balance often determined the success or failure of a reign. Another defining feature of this period was the emergence of a more formalized legal system. As the empire grew, the need for consistent laws and regulations became increasingly urgent. Disputes over property, trade, and governance required resolution, and local customs were not always sufficient to address these issues. Thus, imperial rulers began to establish legal codes that applied across multiple provinces. While some local traditions were preserved, the overarching authority of imperial law ensured a degree of uniformity that helped stabilize the empire. These laws were enforced by judges and magistrates who traveled throughout the provinces, bringing a sense of justice, though often biased toward the elite and the state, into daily life. This development marked an important step in transforming the empire from a loose confederation of conquered territories into a more cohesive political entity. Culturally, this was also a time of flourishing exchange and innovation. As people from different backgrounds came into closer contact, ideas, art, and technologies spread more rapidly than ever before. Architecture blended local styles with imperial influences, creating a rich and diverse aesthetic that could be seen in temples, palaces, and public spaces. Literature and philosophy thrived as scholars from different parts of the empire shared their works and debated their ideas. In some cases, imperial patrons sponsored artists and intellectuals, both to glorify the empire and to promote a shared cultural identity. Religious syncretism also became more common, with gods from different traditions being combined or identified with one another, creating a spiritual landscape that was at once diverse and interconnected. This cultural dynamism contributed to the resilience of the empire, as it allowed diverse peoples to feel part of a larger, shared civilization. Yet, beneath this surface of prosperity and integration, cracks were beginning to appear. The cost of maintaining such a vast empire was immense, and while trade and taxation generated significant revenue, the constant demands of the military and administration strained the treasury. Corruption among officials was a recurring problem, as governors and tax collectors often exploited their positions for personal gain. This not only drained resources, but also fueled resentment among the population, who bore the burden of heavy taxation and arbitrary rule. Moreover, as power became concentrated in the hands of a few elite families, tensions grew between the ruling class and the common people. This inequality planted seeds of discontent that would, in later generations, erupt into more serious challenges to imperial authority. The rulers of this period were keenly aware of these challenges and often attempted reforms to address them. Some sought to standardize taxation, ensuring that burdens were distributed more fairly across different regions. Others cracked down on corruption, dismissing or punishing officials who abused their power. There were also efforts to strengthen the military by improving training, equipment, and pay, thereby securing the loyalty of the legions. These reforms met with varying degrees of success, but they demonstrated the adaptability of the empire, which was essential for its survival. For while the empire was powerful, it was also vulnerable, and without constant vigilance, it risked unraveling under the weight of its own complexity. Religion, too, played an increasingly significant role during this stage of the empire. While rulers maintained a policy of tolerance, they also used religion as a tool of legitimacy. Temples dedicated to the emperor or the imperial family were built, reinforcing the idea that the rulers were chosen by the gods or even divine themselves. This cult of loyalty provided a spiritual dimension to political power, making rebellion not only a political act, but also a sacrilegious one. At the same time, traditional religions continued to thrive, creating a diverse spiritual environment that reflected the broader diversity of the empire. Pilgrimage sites attracted worshippers from across the empire, further strengthening the sense of unity through shared spiritual practices. However, whenever religious groups resisted imperial authority, conflict arose, and the empire was forced to intervene, sometimes with devastating consequences. The second stage of the empire's history was therefore one of consolidation, growth, and complexity. The gains of the early conquests were transformed into a more enduring structure, one capable of sustaining both prosperity and stability across a vast territory. Cities flourished, trade expanded, and cultural exchange enriched the lives of millions. Yet this prosperity was built upon a fragile foundation, depending on the constant balancing of competing interests and the ability of rulers to adapt to changing circumstances. The seeds of future challenges were already being sown as economic strain, social inequality, and political corruption threatened to undermine the empire's achievements. For now, however, the empire remained strong, and its people enjoyed a level of stability and prosperity rarely seen in earlier times. It was a testament to the resilience of the system that, despite all its flaws, it continued to thrive and even expand. The story of this period is not one of unbroken success, but rather one of resilience in the face of constant challenges. The empire endured because it was able to adapt, to blend force with diplomacy, and to integrate diverse peoples into a shared political and cultural system. The rulers of this era may not have achieved the glory of the great conquerors who founded the empire, but they accomplished something equally significant. They ensured that the empire endured, that it became more than just a fleeting power. They laid the groundwork for future generations who would inherit both the successes and the problems of this period. In doing so, they transformed the empire into a lasting civilization, one that would continue to shape the course of history long after their own time had passed. The Flavian dynasty, born out of the ashes of the chaotic year of the four emperors, had by the time of Titus' reign brought a semblance of stability and strength back to the Roman world. Titus himself had ruled briefly but significantly, overseeing the opening of the Colosseum and dealing with the catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. When he died unexpectedly in 81 AD, it was his younger brother Domitian who would ascend to the throne. The reign of Domitian is one of the most fascinating and controversial chapters in the history of the Roman Empire. His rule combined military vigor and administrative efficiency with paranoia, authoritarianism, and a legacy tainted by accusations of tyranny. While later historians often condemned him, modern scholarship recognizes that his reign had significant consequences for Rome's development, strengthening aspects of governance and security that would last well into the 2nd century. Understanding Domitian's rise and reign requires looking at his personality, his policies, and the complicated perception of him by both contemporaries and later chroniclers. Domitian was born in 51 AD, the youngest son of Vespasian and his wife, Domitilla the Elder. Unlike his father and brother, Domitian had not built a strong military career or political reputation before taking the purple. He had grown up in the shadow of his elder brother Titus, who had established himself as a capable general, particularly in the Jewish war, and who was beloved by the people for his charisma. Domitian, by contrast, was seen as aloof, bookish, and less experienced. However, he was ambitious, intelligent, and possessed a keen sense of how power could be centralized. His accession in 81 Pay the Four marked a turning point. Rome moved from the hands of rulers who relied heavily on senatorial support and military achievement to one who leaned toward autocracy, strengthening imperial authority at the expense of the Senate. One of Domitian's earliest priorities was to establish legitimacy and authority. He understood that he needed to distance himself from the perception of being the weaker, less deserving brother. He quickly took on the title of Dominus et Deus, Master, and God, a move that shocked many Romans, particularly senators, who saw this as arrogance and an affront to traditional republican values. Where previous emperors had been careful to present themselves as first among equals, Domitian openly embraced monarchical and divine status. This was a sign of his determination to redefine the imperial role, placing himself above all other figures in Roman society. Domitian's rule had two key pillars: military security and financial stability. On the military front, he pursued campaigns along the frontiers, particularly in Germania and Dacia. The empire's borders were constantly under threat from tribes beyond the Rhine and Danube, and Domitian recognized the importance of securing them. His wars in Germania were not always as successful as propaganda claimed. While he declared victories and held triumphs, the actual results were often less decisive, with some campaigns ending in costly stalemates. Nevertheless, these efforts reinforced the importance of frontier defense and strengthened Rome's military presence in vulnerable regions. Domitian also invested in the building of fortifications and military roads, ensuring long-term security rather than relying only on temporary campaigns. Financially, Domitian was an efficient administrator. He reformed taxation policies, reduced corruption, and stabilized the empire's finances after the turmoil of the civil wars and the costly projects of his brother Titus. He paid close attention to detail, personally overseeing accounts and insisting on accountability from provincial governors and financial officers. These measures, while beneficial for the empire, also contributed to his reputation for being controlling and micromanaging. The strict oversight often created resentment among officials who had previously enjoyed more freedom to enrich themselves. Domitian was also a prolific builder. Like his father and brother, he sought to leave his mark on Rome's architecture and urban landscape. He completed the reconstruction of the Capitoline Temple, which had been destroyed during the civil wars, and he erected monuments celebrating his victories. The Stadium of Domitian, for example, was built to host athletic competitions and remains today as the foundation of Piazza Navona in modern Rome. His architectural contributions demonstrated both his ambition and his desire to solidify the dynasty as legacy in stone and marble. These projects also served a propagandistic function, reinforcing his authority and connecting him to Rome's grandeur. Culturally and socially, Domitian's reign was marked by contradictions. On one hand, he was a patron of the arts and literature, supporting poets like Martial and Statius, who praised him in their works. On the other hand, his paranoia and authoritarian tendencies led to an atmosphere of fear, particularly among the senatorial class. Domitian relied heavily on informers, and treason trials became a hallmark of his reign. Many senators were executed or exiled under charges of conspiracy, often based on little more than suspicion or denunciation. While the broader population may have appreciated his stability, efficiency, and attention to public games and spectacles, the elite classes felt increasingly alienated and oppressed. Religion and ideology also played a central role in Domitian's reign. He took his role as Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, very seriously, and he emphasized traditional Roman religion and morality. He promoted the worship of Minerva, his personal patron goddess, and enforced laws intended to restore traditional values, including restrictions on public behavior. His claim to divine status was not merely rhetorical. He sought to cultivate an image of sacred kingship, aligning himself with the gods and demanding reverence from subjects. This contributed to his reputation as both a reformer of morality and a tyrant who placed himself above all others. Domitian's personal life was also a source of intrigue. He married Domitia Longina, the daughter of a prominent Roman general, which strengthened his political alliances. Their marriage, however, was tumultuous, with reports of infidelity and separations, though they reconciled later. Despite such personal scandals, Domitian projected an image of a moral and disciplined ruler, contrasting himself with emperors like Nero, who had been notorious for excess and indulgence. The defining feature of Domitian's reign, however, was his authoritarianism. He centralized power more completely than any emperor before him, reducing the Senate to a largely ceremonial body and increasing the role of the equestrian order in administration. He appointed equestrians, rather than senators, to key positions, ensuring loyalty and efficiency. While this weakened the influence of the traditional aristocracy, it also created a more professional bureaucracy. Domitian's insistence on loyalty and his ruthless elimination of perceived enemies created an environment in which dissent was dangerous, but the machinery of government functioned smoothly. Yet, as often happens with rulers who rely heavily on fear, Domitian's reign bred resentment. The Senate, in particular, despised him, and plots against his life became increasingly common. His paranoia intensified over the years, leading him to retreat into isolation, surrounding himself with guards, and rarely appearing in public without heavy security. Despite this, he continued to govern effectively, balancing Rome's finances, maintaining the frontiers, and investing in infrastructure. For the common people and soldiers, his reign may have seemed strong and stable. For the elites, it felt oppressive and dangerous. Domitian's downfall came in 96 AD, the result of a conspiracy involving members of his court, including his wife Domitia and court officials. He was assassinated in his palace by members of his household staff. His death ended the Flavian dynasty, which had begun with Vespasian's rise after the chaos of 69 AD. The Senate, which had long despised him, moved quickly to condemn his memory through the practice of damnatio memoria, erasing his name from inscriptions and attempting to obliterate his legacy. In their official accounts, Domitian was painted as a tyrant, a cruel and paranoid ruler whose reign had been a dark chapter in Rome's history. However, the truth about Domitian is more complex. While he certainly ruled with an iron hand, and his paranoia led to real oppression, he was also a capable administrator who stabilized the empire, strengthened its borders, and ensured financial health. His building projects enriched Rome's cultural life, and his efforts to professionalize the administration laid groundwork for future emperors. The Senate's hatred of him and their dominance in writing history meant that his reputation suffered disproportionately. Modern historians have reevaluated Domitian, recognizing that his reign, though harsh, was effective and even necessary in some respects. He was not simply a tyrant. He was a ruler who sought to protect and strengthen Rome, though his methods alienated the powerful elite. The reign of Domitian serves as a reminder of the delicate balance Roman emperors had to maintain between authority and consensus. Too much reliance on senatorial goodwill, as seen in earlier emperors, could lead to weakness or manipulation. Too much reliance on fear and authoritarianism, as with Domitian, created stability at the cost of alienating those who shaped historical memory. His reign marked the end of the Flavian dynasty, but also prepared Rome for the transition into the era of the 5 good emperors, beginning with Nerva, who succeeded him. In this sense, Domitian's legacy is paradoxical. Despised by the Senate, feared by elites, but perhaps respected by soldiers and common citizens who benefited from the order and security he imposed. The empire, by the fourth stage of its narrative, had entered into a period of both consolidation and transformation. What had begun as a fragile power built on conquest and charismatic rulers was now evolving into something far more sophisticated, a system of governance, economy, and culture that needed to sustain millions of people across a vast territory. This phase was marked by reforms, wars of defense rather than expansion, cultural flourishing, and the persistent challenge of keeping diverse populations loyal to a central authority. Unlike the earlier days of conquest, when power could be demonstrated with swords and sieges, the test of empire now lay in maintaining legitimacy across generations. At its core, this part of the story is about how the empire grappled with maturity, balancing stability with inevitable internal strains. The rulers during this era were no longer simply conquerors, but also administrators. Their focus shifted from rapidly annexing new lands to governing effectively the lands already under their control. The empire stretched across multiple climate zones, languages, and traditions, which meant a one-size-fits-all policy could not work. To resolve this, the central government experimented with local autonomy in some provinces while enforcing strict oversight in others. Governors were appointed not just for military ability, but also for administrative skill, and taxation systems became more structured. Rather than arbitrary levies demanded by local rulers, the empire moved towards standardized taxation, often collected in money rather than kind, which facilitated trade and the growth of urban centers. These reforms created stability, but also produced resentment among populations unaccustomed to such centralized demands. Culturally, the empire entered a golden period during this phase. The wealth accumulated from earlier conquests began to be channeled into public works, monumental architecture, and the arts. Cities flourished, becoming centers of learning, trade, and political power. Scholars, poets, and philosophers enjoyed patronage from the imperial court, and their works reflected both loyalty to the empire and a critique of its excesses. Roads, aqueducts, and fortifications improved connectivity, allowing armies to move quickly in times of rebellion, but also ensuring that merchants and travelers could conduct their business with relative security. The empire's ability to foster such an interconnected network became one of its defining strengths, helping spread not just goods, but also ideas, languages, and religious practices across vast distances. Religion itself became a unifying and divisive force during this period. The central government often adopted a pragmatic approach, incorporating the gods and rituals of conquered peoples into a larger imperial framework. Temples were erected that combined local traditions with the empire's official religious practices, creating a sense of inclusion. Yet tensions persisted, particularly when rulers tried to impose too much uniformity. Some provinces resisted cultural assimilation, leading to uprisings framed in both political and spiritual terms. The empire's survival thus depended not on stamping out diversity, but on managing it sometimes through tolerance, other times through suppression. The military, though no longer focused primarily on expansion, remained critical to the empire's identity. The frontier regions demanded constant vigilance. Nomadic groups, rival kingdoms, and discontented former allies tested the empire's borders, requiring both defensive fortifications and occasional punitive campaigns. Veterans were settled in frontier provinces as both colonists and protectors, ensuring loyalty while extending imperial culture. Over time, however, reliance on provincial troops and mercenaries began to erode the cohesion of the core army. This would not become a crisis immediately, but the seeds of future decline were being sown in the reliance on outsiders, whose loyalty might waver in times of crisis. Economically, trade routes became the lifeblood of the empire. Merchants carried silk, spices, metals, and grain across thousands of miles, enriching both private citizens and the state treasury. Ports bustled with ships carrying goods from distant lands, and markets in imperial cities offered luxuries once unimaginable. The state invested in infrastructure to support this commerce, repairing roads, securing sea lanes, and establishing weights, measures, and coinage systems that standardized trade. This prosperity benefited elites the most, but it also trickled down to artisans, farmers, and urban laborers who participated in a growing economic network. Yet alongside this wealth, inequality deepened. Large estates increasingly dominated agriculture, displacing small farmers, and debt slavery became a recurring issue. Though the empire appeared stable, these underlying tensions simmered beneath the surface. Politically, the empire wrestled with succession crises and power struggles. Without a clear system for transferring authority, the death of a ruler often plunged the empire into uncertainty. Powerful generals, ambitious ministers, and rival factions at court competed for influence, sometimes leading to brief civil wars. While the empire usually emerged intact, each conflict strained its institutions and eroded confidence in the central government. Wise rulers attempted reforms, such as codifying succession laws or curbing the power of the military, but these measures rarely held for long. The balance between strong central authority and local autonomy remained precarious. Diplomatically, the empire sought to project both strength and benevolence. Envoys were sent to neighboring kingdoms with gifts and treaties, establishing networks of alliances and client states. In some cases, marriages were arranged between the imperial family and local dynasties, intertwining the fate of the empire with its neighbors. These diplomatic maneuvers brought peace in many regions, but they also made the empire vulnerable to betrayal when allies shifted loyalties. Tribute and recognition of imperial supremacy often mattered more than outright conquest, reflecting a strategic shift toward influence rather than domination. The daily life of ordinary citizens during this phase was shaped by both stability and burden. In cities, people enjoyed theaters, markets, and public baths, benefiting from the infrastructure funded by imperial wealth. In rural areas, farmers labored under heavier taxation and often faced the risk of famine if harvests failed. Festivals and religious rituals provided moments of joy and unity, while conscription and forced labor projects reminded people of the empire's demands. Education expanded, with schools teaching not only practical skills, but also imperial ideology, instilling loyalty in future generations. While life for the common people was often difficult, many recognized the advantages of being part of a vast empire that offered protection and opportunity. The empire's cultural achievements during this period left a lasting legacy. Literature flourished, capturing the grandeur of the empire while also warning of its fragility. Historical chronicles recorded the deeds of rulers and battles, sometimes exaggerating victories, but also preserving valuable accounts of governance and society. Advances in science, medicine, and engineering emerged from the empire's patronage of knowledge, with scholars debating ideas that would influence future civilizations. This intellectual vibrancy was both a reflection of stability and a driver of further progress. Despite these achievements, cracks in the imperial structure began to show more clearly toward the end of this phase. Economic inequality, reliance on mercenaries, succession disputes, and cultural tensions were manageable in the short term, but posed long-term risks. Some provinces grew restless, feeling exploited by distant rulers who demanded taxes but offered little in return. Corruption at the local level eroded faith in justice, and ambitious generals began to see themselves as kingmakers rather than servants of the state. These trends did not yet cause collapse, but they foreshadowed the challenges the empire would face in its next stage. In conclusion, the fourth chapter of the empire's story illustrates both the heights of its achievement and the beginnings of its troubles. It was an era defined by consolidation, cultural flourishing, and economic prosperity, but also by inequality, political instability, and the slow erosion of core institutions. The empire had matured into a vast and sophisticated system capable of awe-inspiring feats, yet it carried within itself the seeds of future challenges. The grandeur of its cities, the brilliance of its thinkers, and the reach of its power were undeniable. But beneath this splendor lay vulnerabilities that would test the resilience of the empire in the generations to come. What made this phase so pivotal was not only its accomplishments, but also the way it set the stage for the struggles that would follow. A reminder that no empire, no matter how mighty, could escape the cycles of growth, strain, and transformation. As the empire entered this final stretch of its formative period, the transformation of its institutions, its people, and its ambitions had reached a decisive stage. The rulers who presided over this age were aware that they inherited not just the crown or military command, but the fragile balance of order in a world that constantly threatened to collapse back into civil war, famine, or foreign invasion. The fifth stage of this journey is marked by both triumph and fragility, a time when stability was no longer just a military matter, but also one of administration, culture, and the ability of the empire to knit together peoples from different regions into something resembling unity. By this time, the provinces had begun to shape the empire as much as Rome itself did. In the east, wealthy cities of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt contributed immense resources, taxes, and trade to sustain imperial ambitions, while in the west, the frontier provinces like Gaul, Britain, and Germania demanded constant defense, often draining resources that the central government desperately needed. The balance between revenue and expenditure became an ever-present concern. The rulers of this age therefore had to think beyond battlefield glory, cultivating the support of the Senate, reorganizing the financial structure of the state, and ensuring that Rome itself remained fed and calm. Bread and circuses, as the saying went, were not merely entertainment, they were a political necessity. The fifth phase was thus a crucible of leadership, testing whether emperors could maintain a system that was beginning to show the strains of its own size. The personalities of the rulers during this stage also played an outsized role in shaping the trajectory of the empire. Where earlier emperors had relied primarily on military might, this period saw rulers who leaned heavily into propaganda, public works, and patronage to cement their legacy. They understood the symbolic importance of architecture and monuments. Massive amphitheaters, new forums, and temples were not just civic improvements, but visible statements of continuity and order. Citizens and provincials alike could look at these structures and see the tangible presence of Rome's as power, and by extension, the legitimacy of the emperor himself. The psychological power of these symbols helped mitigate the memory of civil war and rebellion, offering a sense that peace had been restored under divine favor. Yet behind these facades, political tensions simmered. Senators resented the erosion of their influence, generals eyed the purple with envy, and soldiers expected constant donatives and rewards for their loyalty. The emperor walked a narrow line, simultaneously needing to appear generous, firm, and unchallengeable. Failure in any of these aspects risked catastrophe. In the broader Mediterranean world, the empire's dominance was unchallenged, but not without pressure. The Parthian Empire in the east remained a formidable rival, capable of mobilizing horse archers and heavy cavalry that tested Roman legions. Along the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes probed the empire's defenses, not always through direct warfare, but through raids and pressure that kept the legions occupied. These frontier challenges forced the emperors of this period to think strategically about the distribution of their armies. Some emperors preferred to station legions close to Rome, ensuring they could control politics at the center, while others believed in strengthening the borders, risking a weaker grip on the capital. Each choice carried dangers. Concentrating troops near Rome gave rise to mutinies and rebellions when generals felt slighted. Deploying them to distant frontiers left the capital exposed to political instability. Balancing these needs required constant vigilance, and few emperors could satisfy both demands indefinitely. Domestically, the cultural integration of the empire continued apace. Latin spread further across the western provinces, while Greek remained the dominant language of the East, creating a bilingual imperial culture. This linguistic divide was both a strength and a weakness. On one hand, it allowed local traditions and intellectual currents to flourish. On the other, it foreshadowed the eventual split between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. Religion also played a growing role in this era. Traditional Roman cults continued to dominate public life, but Eastern mystery religions and philosophical schools gained increasing popularity. The emperors often aligned themselves with religious movements to bolster their legitimacy, presenting themselves as chosen by the gods or even semi-divine themselves. This blending of religion and politics would become an enduring feature of Roman imperial ideology, one that later paved the way for even more dramatic religious transformations. Economically, the empire at this stage showed both vitality and strain. The expansion of trade networks brought luxuries from the East's spices, silks, precious stones that enriched Roman elites and dazzled the public. Roads and ports were maintained and expanded to facilitate this commerce, ensuring that the Mediterranean truly functioned as the Romang Mare Nostrum, or Our Sea. Yet the costs of military campaigns, public works, and urban maintenance grew ever heavier. Inflation, debasement of coinage, and corruption in the provinces sometimes undermined confidence in the system. Emperors had to find ways to replenish the treasury, whether through new taxes, confiscations from rivals, or extraordinary levies. Some proved more successful than others. Those who managed to maintain financial discipline left behind a sense of prosperity and stability, while those who squandered resources quickly lost the loyalty of both soldiers and civilians. The empire's fiscal health was thus tied directly to the perceived strength of its ruler. The fifth stage also highlights the evolving relationship between the emperor and the army. By now, it was clear that the loyalty of the legions was the foundation of imperial power. No emperor could rule without their support, and every emperor lived with the fear that a rival general might win that loyalty away. To secure this allegiance, emperors distributed generous donatives, granted privileges to veterans, and emphasized their role as military leaders, even if they personally spent little time on campaign. The image of the emperor as commander-in-chief was cultivated through statues, coinage, and ceremonies. The people of Rome might see their ruler in the forum, dressed in the toga of a statesman, but the legions knew him through his presence on the battlefield, his speeches to the troops, and his ability to share in their hardships. The most successful emperors of this period were those who could embody both aspects of leadership, the civilian administrator and the soldier commander. Failure to balance these roles often ended in betrayal. As this period drew to a close, the empire stood at a crossroads. The institutions established during its early years had proven resilient, yet they were constantly tested by the ambitions of individuals and the pressures of geography and economy. The legacy of these emperors was not uniform. Some were remembered as restorers of order, builders of great monuments, and defenders of the frontiers. Others were castigated as indulgent, corrupt, or tyrannical, their brief reigns marked by instability and ruin. Yet collectively, they demonstrated the adaptability of the Roman system. Even when one ruler fell, the framework of empire endured, reshaping itself around the next. This resilience is perhaps the most striking feature of this stage. The empire had matured beyond the charisma of a single leader. It had become a machine of governance, culture, and military might that could absorb shocks and continue forward. The final years of this stage can be seen as a bridge. On one side lay the chaotic birth of the imperial system, with civil wars and fragile experiments in monarchy. On the other side stretched centuries of imperial rule, during which Rome would dominate the known world in ways unimaginable to the Republic. The emperors of this fifth stage, for all their flaws and triumphs, laid the foundation for this continuity. They were the guardians of a system still in its adolescence, guiding it sometimes wisely, sometimes recklessly into maturity. In their successes, they provided models of effective leadership. In their failures, they offered cautionary tales that later rulers would strive to avoid. History remembers them not just as individuals, but as part of the ongoing story of Rome itself, a story that would continue to unfold for centuries. In reflecting on this fifth phase, one must appreciate the paradox of Rome. It was simultaneously fragile and enduring, dependent on the will of individuals, yet larger than any one person, constantly threatened by internal division, yet capable of immense unity. The emperors of this era embodied this paradox. They struggled, they built, they fought, and they dreamed, each leaving a mark on the vast tapestry of the empire. Their reigns remind us that history is rarely linear, that progress is achieved through cycles of conflict and resolution, and that the survival of a great power depends not just on armies and wealth, but on vision, adaptability, and the ability to inspire belief in the future. As the empire stepped beyond this stage, it carried forward both the scars and the strengths of its past, prepared to face new challenges and to write new chapters in the epic story of Rome.